So we talked about industrialization with our last video, and industrialization, the process where machines take over work that's traditionally done by hand. That's obviously a huge economic trend at the time that's going to be important. Okay, and the last thing we looked at was the wealth inequality that was taking place, and we'll talk about that more in depth later on. But the second issue we want to talk about is transportation changes. The late 19th century allowed for major changes in transportation that are going to be a big change for the world. Obviously, the advent of the railroad is one of the most important changes in transportation. You see a locomotive of the 19th century here that belonged to the United States military. And not only that, you see the changes in networks of railroads. You look at this particular image, the top image of the United States demonstrates railroads built by 1870, and you can see there's a pretty extensive network of railroads for that time frame. But at the same time, you look at the railroads built by 1890 in just a 20-year period, the amount of railroad lines that are laid down in the United States, it's absolutely fantastic to think about the amount of railroad track laid in that time. Okay, and railroads are significant because the development of these railroads came from the steam engine. And the steam engine and the railroads allow for transportation of goods and services and people in ways that are going to make the economy work a lot better. Now that you have industrialization and you have finished goods out of factories, you have to have a way to get them from point A to point B. Obviously, we're still years away from airlines, and we'll talk about ships in a minute, but ultimately, railroads are going to be one of the mechanisms for distributing these products. And the more railroad lines you have, it's more obvious that getting your products to different locations and as many locations as humanly possible becomes much easier. And since 1890, the rail lines in the United States have only developed even further. Not only that, but we're talking about other countries developing these rail lines also. So it allows for that distribution network. And it's not just goods and services, okay? So imagine just with the United States. Whereas if you're in 1870 and you can see that at that point the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished, but still, that's just one line. And so getting your products out west, if you're a producer on the East Coast, is going to be a bit of a chore, right? But the more rail lines that open up, the more opportunities you have to get that out there. This also allows people to move more freely, including the movement of laborers. If you don't like the work opportunities you have, you can go to another city. The free flow of labor is going to change dramatically as well, and that gives laborers a better advantage also. Immigrant labor, especially in the United States, is going to be significant. And not just with railroads too, but the transportation of steamships. Steamships are going to allow more people to go to more places, not just within their country to participate in a labor market, but around the world. Obviously, the United States was desperate to get more immigrants as laborers. At the time, the United States, and still today, one of the great advantages the United States has always had is that it's surrounded by two oceans and two neighbors that we have a pretty friendly process with. The border with Canada is the largest undefended border in the world. So we never have a real issue with that. So America's always free and isolated to work on developing itself. Factories and farmland are always on the rise. Okay? You also see one of the more interesting things is that the railroad, to an extent, causes the standardization of time. You see the map we have here, which you've probably seen before. It's a standardization of time zones. We have different time zones because obviously the sun is shining in some places on the planet and it's not shining in other places. So the time zones help standardize time across distances, great distances. So for example, if it's on the East Coast, if it's 5 p.m., then the next time zone to the west is 1 hour behind, and then the next one 1 hour behind, and so forth. This was done to help make railroads more accessible and more time sensitive to getting to where they're supposed to be at the right time. Time zones, before time zones, you would just set your basically set your watch or your clock by a certain point in the day. That sunrise would be a certain point in the day, a certain time of the day, and you would operate there. The time could vary from one town to the next in a particular time zone. And that's always a strange thing to even imagine in our modern world. Okay, the steamship, obviously, what we said there, within the United States, you just think about something like the Mississippi River and the Ohio River and the ability to navigate those and to get goods and services up and down those major waterways. But this is true of not just the United States, but the world at large. During that time frame, you have the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal are going to be built, which allow ships to get to and from various continents a lot more quickly than they did in the past. So the steam engine, the steamship, locomotive, those are going to be major forms of transportation that matter. Let's talk very briefly about communication as well. Okay, communication is important in terms of economic development. The advent of the telegraph, which you see here, the telegraph, a machine that allows you to transmit information and messages over great distances. And in the 1800s, they had telegraph wires established everywhere, but in the latter part of the 19th century, they started to develop a wireless telegraph. You can see here that the image on the left is a diagram for a telegraph receiver, and the one on the right is a transmitter. So you would tap the one on the right, and you use, this is where Morse code becomes popular. Use Morse code to tap out a particular message, and the receiver would print out the message onto a little ticker tape. And when you hear of the phrase ticker tape parades, they would use leftover ticker tape for that purpose. But anyway, all that to say is that communication over great distances changes. Business decisions are made, and not only are business decisions made, but they can be centralized. So let's say you have your business headquarters in New York City. You can communicate to every outlet that you have in the world, or every business partner, or every distributor, what you want done, when you want done, or when you want it done. So it's a major boon for the economy as well. So now the world is getting smaller with industrialization, the ability to produce these finished goods, and the transportation networks and the communication networks allow you to make major changes. This is a huge reason why the GDP goes up so dramatically. Businesses are able to centralize and coordinate and get their message out to their subsidiaries and the people who distribute their information, and the customers as well.